Right. Well, welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. We really appreciate it, wherever you're dialing in from today. My name is Johnny from the organisation behind the Festival of Debate, which is called Opus Independence. The festival programme this year runs from the 16th of April all the way through to the 25th of May and includes over 65 events, 150 speakers and 50 partners. The festival aims to explore the entangled ecological, economic and political crises we collectively face. There are no easy answers, but we hope the festival creates a space to explore and hold complexity and uncertainty and brings together a community of people to make change where they are. Most of our events are free at the point of access. Where we do need to charge, we keep ticket prices as low as we possibly can. If you'd like to make a donation to the festival, you can so by visiting the website, which most of you will have done so to book these tickets. But if anyone that hasn't, it's the festivalofdebate.com, which I will post in the chat. We want to tell the kinds of stories about the societal challenges and big opportunities for positive change we're seeing through these events. You will get an email asking you for your feedback after this event, so please do fill that in and send it back through to us because it helps us understand your perspectives and your part in those positive changes. This is not just an event to raise awareness of important subjects and have discussions. As much as possible, we want the festival to roll on into people working together, doing things and taking actions. Justin O'Connor is a professor of cultural economy at the University of South Australia and a visiting professor at the School of Cultural Management, Shanghai Jingtong University. Between 2012 and 2018, he was a member of the UNESCO Expert Facility, supporting the 2005 Convention on the Protection and Promotion of Cultural Diversity. Previously, he helped set up Manchester's Creative Industries Development Service and has advised in Europe, Russia, Korea, Vietnam, and China. Under the UNESCO EU Technical Assistance Programme, he has worked with the Ministries of Culture in both Mauritius and Samoa, and he is currently working with the Research Collective. So, Justin, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Johnny, for that, and thanks for the festival more generally for having me on. It's an amazing festival. You know, as you say, stretching over 6 weeks and so many people. So I'm a mere speck in the overall thing, but it's great to be part of the collective, really, I suppose. Today, I'm just going to talk about my book. This book, Culture is Not an Industry. And I wanted to say, first of all, just where it came from, because some people might think it's a kind of a direct attack on how bad the commercialization of culture is and things like that. It's a bit more complex than that, I think. And I'd just also like to say that, you know, it's also a mea culpa, because in the 90s, I was very much involved in Manchester, as you heard from Johnny. I was involved in Manchester. I was very enthused by the music scene in Manchester. I went to the Hacienda and that kind of thing. And the aftermath of that big kind of decade of the 80s, where the city seemed to change. And, you know, in the 70s and 80s, Manchester was seen to be this kind of declining city. And then suddenly in the 90s, wherever it was going, there was so much energy and so much creativity, and then some amazing music created there. And I have to say, in other parts, and we're in Sheffield, you know, the festival's located in Sheffield, you know, similar things could be said about what came out of Sheffield and many other cities. And again, not just in the UK. So for me, I just wanted to say really that this, the idea of culture as being, the idea of culture as being not an industry, it's not from some kind of elite, you know, Olympian view from above the clouds. It actually comes from an experience of being someone who's promoted the idea that culture is in some ways, you know, we used to call them cultural industries. So let me explain a bit about that, because it certainly, for us working in the early 1990s, culture was very much about a democratic if you like, or bottom-up culture, it was grassroots culture. Nobody ever gave those bands or, factory records or any of those, nobody ever gave them any money, in terms of government grants or anything like that. And at the time, that was where the energy was. Amazing energy, amazing inventiveness, amazing kind of a combination of popular culture and modernism that some of you might know Mark Fisher and his idea of popular modernism. It really was something that struck me in the city at the time. And of course, the cityscape of the city changed. New spaces emerged. People were doing stuff. When I first began looking at this, I walked out of the university. I was working at the university and found in every nook and cranny of the old factories and all these old buildings and t-shirt designers, fanzine makers, filmmakers, musicians, band managers, record labels, all that kind of thing. So it was really just to say that a lot of what became the creative industries had a very powerful, let's say, utopian impulse. It was a very powerful kind of affective attraction for these things. They seem to be going somewhere. They seem to be positive and forward-looking and changing the world a little bit, really. And so what I say in the book is very much critical of what came out of that. And what came out of it at the end of the 1990s was the idea of creative industries. It was codified by the New Labour in the UK, but very soon the idea spread across Europe. It actually spread to the Far East, Singapore and Shanghai and Taiwan. Various places in the Far East picked it up. And within, at the end of that decade, around the end of around 2010, UNESCO and other international organizations were really pushing the idea of creative industries. The global south can develop. We can have fashion industries in Nairobi. We can have music industries in Africa. We can, the whole kind of development agenda. Suddenly, the creative industries would lead it that way. So it became a very powerful idea. And what I say in my book is really to try and raise some real problems about it. That in fact, although it drew on that energy of popular culture, it seemed to promise a kind of a new kind of a democratic culture. What in fact it became was the reduction of culture to a kind of an economic growth engine. We might call it neoliberal if you want to put that kind of label on it. But it very quickly went from this kind of really energetic, optimistic idea to something that was basically driven by consultants, by economic analysts, by metrics, by a whole range of kind of consultancies who were promoting this as a new industrial sector. And while we were very clear that it did involve commerce, that people involved in culture were doing it often, outside the public funding system, that it wasn't purely about economics. It wasn't purely about some kind of an industrial system. It was about culture in that way. And so my book really starts off by saying why I feel that the creative industry is what it did to that. Many people in the cultural sector bought into it. And in fact, the UK government, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, as it became, really took the idea because, of course, it solved a problem for them. And the problem was that for the last, since 1980, culture has been seen as merely a consumer economy or a waste of money, waste of public money, spending money on the arts and all these kind of things. It was called upon to justify its existence economically speaking. And the creative industries, of course, came up with it was a great answer to that question, because it said we're the fastest growing industry, we're the industry of the future. In the future, it's not about industry, it's post-industry, it's about creativity is the new oil. And of course, famously, Richard Florida, some of you might know Richard Florida, wrote a book called The Creative Class in 2003. And he said, well, the creative class will inherit the earth. The creative class own the means of production. The means of production are in their heads. they are the new creative economy was owned by the creatives. It was in their heads. It was part of what they did. So it was this kind of big promise. The old style industry is gone, but a new industry is coming, and this industry will be owned by the creative class, by the creatives. So on a whole range of registers, I wanted to say that this was not true. That in fact, as we look from if we look from right across the trajectory from 1998, when New Labour launched the idea of creative industries, all the way through to now, we actually see creative workers, cultural workers, increasingly precarious, increasingly low paid, lacking in autonomy, lacking a real clear career path, basically becoming a kind of joining the precariat, as some people call it. They really lose their position. So they've certainly not gained the keys to the new creative world. On the other hand, we also see the rise of the people who really have benefited are the big corporate monopolies. 6 out of 10 largest companies on the planet are somehow involved in the production and distribution of culture. So Amazon and Facebook, Meta, Enviva, the AI company, Disney, all those other people, they're involved in somehow in the production and distribution of culture. They're global, they're more influential than ever, they have more control over the workforce, they take more of the profits than any of the workers. So they're the real beneficiaries of this shift towards the the creative economy. So that's one side of the story. One of the other things that really I try to talk about in the book is, it sounds like the creative industries. Well, it's quite clear. It's all those industries like film, TV, more traditional arts, music industry, radio, broadcasting, all those kind of things, computer games. These were all in the list that were promoted by the UK government in 1998. But in fact, they slipped in one extra category, and that was basically IT software and computing, and instantly doubled the figures. So when we talk about creative industries, actually, most of the time, all the talk is of some cultural things. It can be design, it can be fashion, it might be TV, radio, etc. But in fact, at least 46% of all the employment in the sector and all the wealth generation in the sector comes from IT and computing, which is nothing to do with the cultural sector. I'm not saying it's not important. I'm not saying these people are not creative in some ways, but the IT and computing can include software designers and coders, but it can also be database developers in a coal mining company, if you like. They're not part of what we would consider the cultural sector, and yet they're routinely used to bump up the figures. Now, I wasn't going to talk too much about that because about the idea of creative industries until I was just trying to talk about it very briefly before moving on to a more positive thing. But I came across this week the Labour Party, the UK Labour Party, which will probably, I suppose, become the next government of the United Kingdom. And they've released their cultural policy, which is all about creative industries, all about growth. It's all about they're the fastest growing this. They add billions and billions to the economy. And I just wanted to say again that, first of all, anytime you see any of those figures, you can chop them in half, because most of that is nothing really to do with the cultural sector. But also strip out marketing and advertising. That's another growth sector. Again, we can call them cultural, but they're not the ones that usually appear on the glossy brochures. When you get into the real figures, when you look at what they call the cultural sector, and I mean here television and broadcasting, screen, computer games, all those kind of things, as well as the traditional arts, they are a much smaller sector that's proclaimed in these figures. So there's a smoke and mirrors going on with the economic claims. They don't stack up. I'm not going to talk about it in any detail. They do not stack up, whatever people say. And it's quite hard sometimes to I say it to a lot of my students. They say, well, is the creative industries this or that? And I say, well, actually, the creative industries doesn't exist. It's a construct. It's a statistical construct. When I'm in South Australia here, you can't see because it's night, but it's a wine producing area of the country. Now, if you go to if you go to one of their conferences, or wine conference, or you may go to a dairy, there's a cheese industry around here as well. Go to these industrial conferences, and there's lots of debates about organic wine, or you go to a car industry and it's electric versus petrol or diesel or whatever. You go to a creative industries conference and they spend most of their time trying to define what the creative industries is. And this is after 25 years. So if there's an industry that can't quite fully express what it is and what it means after a quarter of a century, then we really do have some problems. So it's confusing, it's incoherent, but what it actually does do is something I think the most damage it does. It reduces culture to an industrial sector. And as I say in the book, of course, culture has lots of big industries in. As I've just said, 6 of the biggest companies on the planet are involved in some way with the production and distribution of culture. So, of course, there are industries, but culture itself is not an industry. We might say the same about health. Health employs far, far more, 10 times more than culture. It involves far more capital investment, etc., etc. But we don't say health is an industry. Of course we do. Sometimes say the health industry, but we value it because it brings health. It's there to deliver a certain basic service to society, which is that of health. It's not there as an engine of growth primarily. And so in my book, what I wanted to do was to say, let's stop talking about culture as an industry. Let's move it back to where I think it should be, which is part of the, if you like, the basic foundations of a civilized society, of a modern democratic society, alongside health, education, social services, essential infrastructure. Those are the things that we see as the foundations of a society. We need those, they're the basics. And I'm saying we need to put culture back in that space. It actually should be seen as a part of the system of the public service. Now, that's not to say that, let's, nationalize culture, or let's just turn culture back into everything's publicly subsidized. That's neither possible, nor I don't think. I think it's not desirable either. What it is to say is that the health of culture, whether it's actually performing its function more generally in society, whether it's actually fit for purpose, is something that should be judged, not whether it grows jobs and employment or something like that, whether it's an expanding industrial sector, but whether it performs its function as a healthy social sector, if you like. And that is difficult because we've been so used to seeing culture as either as an industry, as some kind of consumer thing, or as some kind of residual, all the things that the market can't do well, but sometimes the state has to pick up, whether that's libraries or the opera or things like that. So what I'm saying, we really needed to have a fundamental rethink of where culture is on that, at that level. Now, while I was doing some of the work on this book, during the pandemic, I began to read a lot of kind of heterodox economics, of which there's a lot around now. So certainly from about 2008, 2010, with the global financial crisis, it became clear that all was not well in the, if you like, the standard mainstream description of neoliberal globalization. That markets are good, markets will deliver growth. The role of the state is to get out of the way. The market is always more efficient than the heavy hand of the state. All these kind of things. More trade is good. The more deregulated, the better. All those kind of things which we learned to believe in the 80s and 90s. And the global financial crisis set a lot of put a big question marks around that. For all sorts of reasons. One, because of the actual crisis. Two, because of the massive inequality that became very clear. It was already becoming clear that society was becoming more and more unequal. You look at what happened across the crisis, the financial crisis, and the rich, the people who seem to lose money, oh, my stocks have disappeared through the floor in the financial crisis. They were bailed out by the banks. And the people who actually paid for it were normal people who depended on services. So since 2010, the UK government, for example, has cut local authority funding by 50%. And of course, as we all know, if we're in the UK, we know that the growing bankruptcy of Birmingham, I think Nottingham, lots of cities, big and small, are declaring bankruptcy because they cannot provide the basics. So these are the questions that came up, and what struck me was that I was very much interested in, as I say, heterodox economics. People like Kate Raworth, who wrote the book called Donut Economics, and she said, well, economics focused on GDP and growth. Let's stop doing that. Let's look at what the economy does to make, if you like, our living together better. What provides collective well-being. And so she talks about the social foundations. There are certain basics that we all need: services, access to food, water, infrastructure, etc., below which we can't describe it as a decent society. And again, coming back to the UK, we all know that those social foundations now are in real problems. People are falling through the cracks quite regularly. And she's began to talk about that. I was very much taken by the foundational economy people. It's a group, Foundational Economy Collective, based in Manchester, who began to talk about, well, what do we need as the foundations for a decent society? So they began to talk about, we need essential infrastructure, we need basic services, education, health, public administration, all those kind of things. These are the things that are really important, and we should start to think about the economy as organized around them, not about high growth industries and those kind of things. So I talk a lot about this in the book, and I try to say, well, why don't we see culture, instead of seeing culture, or the creative industry model is of a high growth, perhaps high tech, high employment, high wealth generating industry that's going to drag us all into some kind of growth driven future. Why don't we see culture as actually part of the social foundations, something essential for what we do on a day to day? It's essential to how we live together. And this really stepped forward during the pandemic, for example. So in the pandemic, there was a lot of talk about, hang on, maybe culture is something more than just a growth industry. Maybe it's something that's absolutely essential to us. And also many people began to talk about the local cultural infrastructure. No going off to Gran Canaria for the weekend. Let's walk in the park. Oh, hang on, what's happened to our parks? What's happened to our community centres? What's happened to the local libraries, the local record shops, the local spaces that we're all exploring now? So there's been a return to the idea of, where's our social infrastructure? A lot of talk about that now, but also where's our cultural infrastructure, the basic cultural infrastructure that we all take for granted or should take for granted, but suddenly seems to be disappearing. So this is where I began to think about, well, let's reorientate culture away from this industrial sector to something, first of all, that's part of our basic infrastructure, communal infrastructure, local infrastructure. It's about the libraries and community spaces. It's about education, education facilities. Who has access to music lessons or dance lessons or whatever, but also rehearsal spaces, to local places where you can make stuff, whether that's a fanzine or do your own. All those places, those creative places that we used to take for granted, certainly in the 90s, we took them for granted, that suddenly seem to be disappearing in the present. And the important thing for me was that some of those are provided by the state, or at least guaranteed by the state. So libraries is a kind of the classic example. But some of them, record shops, small-scale venues, pubs that have music or readings, little independent film cinemas, or even places that just show films, all those places that make a place worth living in. How are we going to take care of them? How do we see them as part of the local economy? Because from a creative industries perspective, they're seen as that small entrepreneurial, we call them SMEs, small and micro enterprises. They're enterprises, and their main job would be to grow bigger and bigger and bigger, and all that. What if they're happy to make a living? Everybody wants to make a living, but they're happy to make a living, to contribute to that local space. How do we support this kind of ecosystem here? So for me, infrastructure was, yes, it was about some of the big kind of state support stuff, but it's also about these local, small, everyday economies. And it was interesting that the foundational economy people did a survey of employment, which we tried to do, replicate in Australia as well. And they found that in general, outside of London, which we'll come back to perhaps, but something like 70% of all employment is in infrastructure. And some of that is material, water, roads, electricity, gas, those kind of things, utilities, but also in everyday economies, small-scale local economies, and as well as the social services, the social services, education, health, etc. So infrastructure, services, and small-scale local economies, cafes, restaurants, whatever, these make up 70% of employment. This is where the wealth is. This is where the Commonwealth is. This is where most of us live. And I wanted to say, well, let's place culture in that area of the infrastructure of basic services and of small-scale everyday economy. Let's start there and see if we can rethink what culture should be. So that was kind of my more positive way of doing it, and it connects with a lot of other things about the commons, which has grown up in the last 10, 15 years. The ideas of the commons and sharing connects with ideas of social and cultural infrastructure. But I wanted to finish by actually invoking something as fundamental to that, really, which is cultural rights. And again, that's crept back in, because it's all very well talking about creative industries and employment and what it can give, or what it's supposed to give, what it promises. But to found the idea of culture as something that is a service, if you like, or it's something that the state should be responsible for, at least providing the space for it to happen. That the basis of that kind of cultural policy is cultural rights, and by that I mean something very basic, which is it's there in the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights, the United Nations Declaration, which is everybody has a right to the full participation in art and culture. And this is backed by a whole range of declarations ever since then. People have the right to fully participate in the cultural life of the society in which they exist. It's pretty basic, and of course it's very unspecified, but that is the ground on which I think we should move forward. And one of the things I talk about in terms of infrastructure or foundationally, culture as part of the foundational economy is, okay, it's okay saying people should have a right to fully participate in culture, but at the same time, we've got to make that real. And my shorthand for cultural infrastructure is that which provides the ground on which cultural rights can be exercised. That's about hard infrastructure. It is about spaces, libraries, again, community centres, rehearsal spaces, small-scale shops. It is about that hard infrastructure, if you like, but it's also about that soft infrastructure, often provided by institutions, by educational institutions, by local small cultural outfits that are funding in all sorts of different ways. The thick, dense kind of institutional and also maverick kind of ecosystem that sustained a lot of our cities up till quite recently. So that's that's my line. We have to, which is a radical rethink of cultural policy, to realign cultural policy. Johnny talks about new transformative ideas, to realign culture with this transformation. Because what I'd noticed, certainly over the last 10 years, is how culture dropped out of that thing. You know, there are many radical people talking about ecology here in Australia, about Indigenous and Aboriginal communities. We've got new approaches to communities, all these kind of attempts to rethink the commons, rethink the foundations of economy, rethink how we relate to the world. And I found that the cultural sector was absent from that. There are many artists involved, of course, but actual people talking about public policy and culture didn't really get that. And I really wanted to get the idea of culture back, align that with something about radical transformation. And I don't mean in any kind of simplistic or kind of facile idea of radical, hey, let's be radical. I mean that it's part of the reimagining of the world that we all need to do. And as some other talks in this festival will show, as well as elsewhere, we're to really what's the word for it? We're just kind of, it's a very challenging moment, and globally on all sorts of levels, geopolitically, in terms of ecology, in terms of economy, and in terms of democracy, all those things. They're really, all the red lights are flashing, and we really do need to imagine a different kind of future. And ultimately, what I want to say in this book is that culture's got to be part of that reimagining, because that's what culture does. You know, at the end of the day, culture makes stuff up. That's what it makes stories up, it makes sounds up, music up, it makes stuff. It's the site of our imagination. And I am convinced that we cannot enter the future if we turn the site of this imagination into some kind of industrial sector. Okay, I'll finish there anyway. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Justin. That was genuinely fascinating as someone who has kind of surfed all sorts of different routes through what is defined in different ways as arts and culture and creative industries for many, many years now. Yeah, there were loads of interesting stuff in there and loads of great stats and facts and figures to back it up. So thank you so much for that. We have a number of questions in the chat. The first question we are going to go to is a question from Sammy. If you are there, hopefully you have a invitation to unmute.
Yeah. So do you think that as long as neoliberalism prevails in the West, people will continue to see other cultures, like African ones, for example, as capital tools under the pretext of, progressiveness or including other cultures or diversity, while ignorant to the actual people who are actively from those cultures, living in those countries, who are suffering from the same Western nations' neo-imperial exploitative gain, for example, forceful extract of natural resources?
Yeah, I mean, I'm writing something about this at the moment. It's a really complex question, but also something very simple. From about really the turn of the millennium, that many of the development agents really sold creative industries as the way forward, because creative industries, it's the new economy, it's the next big thing. But you don't need millions and millions of dollars in capital investment to make a factory or to, some aluminium smelting corporation. Actually, it's just creativity. So that they really sold that, and I think for very good reasons. Why not? People really picked it up and ran from it. And so many of the agencies, you see lots of pictures of great creative, fashion designers in Nairobi, or computer games people in Chile or Santiago, those kind of things. They've sold the idea that the global South can really start to develop through this kind of creative industry stuff. And UNESCO, who were very much responsible for this, published a report in 2022, and it was a pretty stark statistic, which is 95% of the global trade in cultural services was from the global North. Now, that's a pretty devastating judgment on 20 or 30 years of the promise that the global south will somehow benefit from this. So, and there's a big shift now. So there are a lot of people in the global south are moving away from that and really trying to, in fact, go back to some of the movements of the 1980s where they're saying, hang on, whose culture, what culture, our culture is being extracted, in different ways now. We're all globally diverse. So, in Nairobi, a fashion designer is brilliant, but what happens to her if she goes to New York or something, So there's much more of a sense in the global south of trying to assert diversity, if you like, but also the models of their culture. And, we've got to return to that attempt to stop that extraction of culture, that easy way of just taking their culture and start thinking about how those cultures are protected, if you like, if that's the right word, nurtured, stopped from over exploitation in that way. I'm not sure if I answered the question, but that's...
Thanks, Justin. Next, Joy, we are going to come over to you if you'd like to ask your question.
Yeah, I was wondering what you thought about arts and lottery funding, whether it restricts local culture and puts it all to a homogenous production. I mean, I'm reminded of a Labour MP that said we hadn't got any culture because we didn't have an opera company, but we have 12 brass bands, we have a lot of local heritage.
Yeah, I mean, well, there's lottery funding. I mean, there's the ethical thing, many people, the people who put in the money for the lottery, buy the tickets, are kind of desperate people who want to win shitload of money to get them out of where they are, and yet that tends to go to art forms that are consumed by people who don't need a shitload of money, by the middle classes, if you want to call it that. So there's that ethical asymmetry that was there from day one. But then the other question would be, well, you've got this pot of money, however you've got it, what do you do with it? And of course, the idea that this then goes into large scale, big opera companies or theatres or art galleries. I mean, I'm nothing against theatres and opera galleries. I mean, but it was launched as without thinking through or without a return to the idea of what kind of cultural facilities do we need to provide to people? What do they want? How do we provide them at that local level? There's a whole range of questions that could have been asked about how do we best spend this in an equitable way that properly services the cultural needs and desires of the various populations. But instead it was turned into we've got to showcase the city, regenerate the city, which is most often property development, that they were the main beneficiaries of it. Or, we want an iconic building here and an iconic building there. And again, now and again, icons perhaps collectively are maybe good. People do want to see big icons and things, but we missed the chance to really properly think about what is it that we want to fund in the cultural sector. And I should say, the other side to the lottery funding, which tends to go, as we all know, more building than operations. The other side to that is the cutting of more regular forms of funding, the imposition of all sorts of economic targets on existing cultural institutions, the cutting of, university cultural courses and all those kind of things that go with it. And of course, local authority funding being cut massively over the last 10 years. So it's a siphoning off of it. There are many good things that came out of lottery funding. Many of them are invisible, but in the main, it was used to fill up. You fill one bucket while you deliberately empty another bucket, and it was never properly thought through what we really need to spend it on.
Really interesting and really important. Thank you for that question, Joy. Emmy asks, I'm already on my second career path after the pandemic gutted theatre, and now my job role is threatened by AI, lost my copywriting job due to ChatGPT. A two-part question. Is digital technology a threat or opportunity to the creative career in the near future? How can we adapt and even thrive when technology is evolving so quickly and changing society in ways we couldn't imagine?
Well, thanks for that small question there. Well, the answer is, I mean, here we are on a Zoom. I'm talking to all these fantastic people throughout the world, and of course, the digital has been an amazing set of tools, possibilities that's affected all areas of culture, all areas of culture production. And of course, as we know, all areas of health and education and finance and whatever. It's been pretty transformative. Its impact on the cultural sector, of course, was touted, but in the late 90s as again transformative. We were all going to be citizen journalists or citizen producers. The democratization of culture, the democratization of communication, all those kind of things that were promised. And of course, what the digital, anybody who creates, it's kind of opens up possibilities, takes a lot of drudgery out of things. I mean, even just, I write books, but just using a typing, a keyboard, a computer, makes my labor, my hard grunt labor, far easier, and that's the case for many. So the possibilities are great, but of course, what's the answer? Follow the money. AI, something like AI, I think it has quite a lot of possibilities if it's used kind of correctly. But at the moment, it's being driven out on a basis of massive profitability. So we all know that it's use of electricity. It's now, and it's a small country, isn't it? Just one company uses something like a quarter of the GDP of whatever, I don't know, invent a country there. Huge amounts of electricity that's going to ratchet up. They're now investing in nuclear powered generators for that thing. But for me, what's interesting is they're running out of data. They train, AI gets trained on stuff that's out there, done by you and me. We all put it out there, and AI trains itself on that. It's running out of data. So now there's this stuff about synthetic data. So it's going to make its own data it's actually a real disaster what's allowed. And it's happened maybe in 2 or 3 years when people start messing around with image. Let's say 5 years it's happened. But it's a condensed version of what's happened to the internet. And as I say, very broadly, a transformation on the level of Gutenberg, on the level of the print revolution of the 15th century. That's what happened in the late 90s, and we gave it to a bunch of psychopaths in Northern California. I mean, these guys are digging bunkers. They're flying off to Mars. They're refreshing their blood by 20-year-old. These are the people who are running the Gutenberg revolution, if you like. So I think it's been pretty much a disaster, and somehow, and I think people are aware now, we need to pull back control of that. That's the very broad picture, and that's communications generally. But in terms of the creatives, all those stories about being pushed out by chat, somebody wrote recently, the best thing that ChatGPT and similar companies could do is actually pay citizen journalists to go out and create the data that then goes on to train the IA things. So there's a real contradiction coming. There's a contradiction whereby the number of errors of these kind of generated so-called intelligence, the errors are increasing, the plagiarism are increasing, the lawsuits are increasing. So I think there's going to be a big crisis there at the moment, and the owners will attempt to overcome that crisis by throwing billions at it. and it's big jurisdictions such as the US, although they're out to lunch, but the EU, but I think also other global organizations, weak though they are, need to assert themselves back against that. So that there's a global dimension to this, which is giving over culture to basically massive statistical data crunching machines run by billionaires, but also on the individual level of, giving over creative tasks to machines. What really do we think we're doing? And if culture was written, if culture was run for the purpose of providing culture rather than providing profit, then we'd have a different scenario in front of us.
Yeah, it's an absolutely fascinating subject. For anyone wanting to learn more about that and many other things, there's a really interesting podcast called Your Undivided Attention, and it's made by some of the people that were behind The Social Dilemma, the documentary on Netflix. And they actually describe kind of technology and the rise of AI as our first order problem, because if we don't kind of deal with that and the way that it kind of is just infiltrated in our society and doing so much stuff, then we lose the ability to deal with what should be our primary concern, which is the breakdown and health of the biosphere. And all sorts of interesting stuff about how it is, infiltrating, not in a kind of it's going to come and take your jobs way, in a kind of it's already a part of your job. I have a really nice quote that they refer to from Edward O. Wilson, who says the real problem of humanity is that we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology, and it's all terrifically dangerous and is now approaching a point of crisis overall. And I absolutely love that. We are going to go back to Jonathan. So the question was, the book makes a convincing plea for what may be phrased as the overcoming of conditions of neoliberalism. My question is about the scope of this aspiration. Whom is the book addressing? In the UK right now, there is a lot of devolution style policy frameworks, especially obviously in Manchester leading the way on that. And so the second part of that question is, how much of the overcoming of the conditions of neoliberalism can be done locally through devolved city governance or new avant-garde social formations?
Hard one that. I mean, actually, I think neoliberalism's kind of done in the as a coherent historical project. It's kind of finished, I think. And in the book I quote Martin Wolf, the Financial Times commentator, saying that neoliberalism, the Washington consensus is gone, the neoliberalism gone. Even Keir Starmer's admitting that now. It's quite the question is what will come after it, and there are already clear things that some are. Hopefully, there are visions beyond it, and I think people are far more able to talk about that than they were back in the days when Mark Fisher talked about capitalist realism. There's no outside of capitalism. Now there is an outside of capitalism, certainly for many people, but also there's an outside of neoliberalism that's much darker, and we know this from the far right. We know this from and not just the crazy figures on the far right, but some really powerful figures that are dragging the centre to the right. So the world is changing in ways that maybe we don't really like it. So it's not really just overcoming neoliberalism. It's actually asserting, well, what do we want to replace it with, and what kind of political energies do we need to do that? And some of those are actually, so they're quite complex. It's not just about recognition of the problems. It's also things like an assertion of reassertion of democracy, reassertion of certain kind of basics of economics that were missed. Anyway, a whole range of things that we need a more positive program. Can that happen at a local level? I think to some extent it has to. I think if we do get real devolution, then certain things can change a little bit, hopefully. My worry, and this goes back very quickly, look at the time, goes back to when you said, who's the book addressed to? And it's, in a way, it's addressed to it's an attempt to say there is another way of talking about culture. There is another set of languages, concepts to talk about culture than this that we've been faced with the creative industries, and that this other way of talking about culture can connect up with some of these questions about what comes next. How do we get to this next place? I'm hoping that somehow that can appeal to the kind of large-scale devolved authorities that might be emerging, because they're more in touch with than certain kind of foundational needs of their population, especially in somewhere like Manchester. It's much more difficult at a national level. So of course, at the national level, they just talk about growth and things like that. But so there is more possibilities there. I would like to see a kind of a more articulate, a more confident kind of cultural sector, and I mean that in the very broadest sense, connect with other kind of transformative agendas and start saying, start making demands. At the moment, the cultural sector is almost cowed. It's like, oh, we need more money, which they do. People are very poor, very insecure, precarious, leaving the sector. Where is the confident voice coming from? That needs to happen. It needs to transcend this preoccupation with participation and equity of a band-aid kind of nature, sticking a plaster on it. So we really need to think of a more confident voice for this is a transformative role of culture. We need to change culture the way we've been thinking about it for the last 20 years. And we need to do it in alignment with these new focuses on infrastructure, on cultural infrastructure, social infrastructure, on the kind of everyday jobs in the care sector, in education, in all those places that are not about productivity. There's all these kind of discourses going. They can be done at the local level, but I think it's going to take a bit of time before, going contradict himself. A certain kind of zombie neoliberalism, at the big level, neoliberalism's gone, but the day-to-day level, the people doing the metrics, people working under the bonnet of public administration, they're working within a framework that was set 30 or 40 years ago. And that's really where the fight is in some ways.
Thank you very much. We are going next over to Gareth to ask your question.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Johnny, and thanks, Justin. It's been a fascinating hour. You've really led into the question nicely, but I just was hoping you might relate what you've been talking about specifically to Sheffield, particularly given our recent history, shifting from industrial to post-industrial economies. And for example, the council-led development of the cultural industries quarter, the CIQ in the 1980s and 1990s. So where did you, where did this take the city, and where will it take us next?
Yeah, well, I was kind of around when some of that was happening. I remember sat around in the quarter itself, talking to what's his name? Oh, I've forgotten his name now, from the Human League. Yeah. Anyway, that moment was quite experimental, and it was quite forward-looking. Many people had come out of the London experience, and the idea that maybe we, steel is done, steel has gone, or the industrial steel has gone. Can we use culture to somehow find new employment, new jobs? And that was not a bad thing, and it wasn't a cynical thing. I think it really spoke to people really trying to look beyond the present, and look into culture to help them that. I think it was always ill-founded. I think the cultural industries were never going to provide the jobs that industry once produced, and certainly not the same kind of jobs. And we must remember, of course, that Sheffield's now producing more steel than it did at the height of its great industrial moment. It's producing a lot of steel. It's just for workers. Many of the manufacturing countries that we think, oh, they've all gone to Asia. They're actually still making it, but it's robots and few highly skilled workers. So culture was never going to provide the jobs, replacement for the jobs. Actually, I think it had other things to do. It actually provided quite clearly, it provided a way of rethinking what Sheffield was, what Manchester was, what Glasgow was, etc., what Liverpool was. What were these places? What do we do in these places? What, you know, again, do we really want a job, you know, these hard industrial jobs, when here, you know, somewhere on the horizon is these jobs that we really, really want to do. We want to make music, or, you know, books or fashion or whatever. We you know, we can really fulfill ourselves. And I think that was the promise, not the sheer number of jobs that would suddenly come over the horizon, but can we have can we actually think of work as something that's fulfilling, that's creative? And again, not all work can be creative, and etc., etc. But I think that was also the promise that was there in Sheffield, and it was there in Manchester. And I saw it at the time. You know, shall we think about a city, an economy that does work differently, that allows us to be our own bosses to some extent, allows more autonomy, more creativity, and so it's not just the number of jobs that I think failed to deliver, but that kind of work failed to deliver. And I think that's one of the misplaced promises of the 90s. We got worse work, we got shit work, we got unpaid work, we got precarious work, when we could maybe have had something different. So I you know, I look back at those places, and of course very quickly, you know, the creative industry quarter turned into a consumer thing, you know, with the popular music centre and similar places, similar kind of developments elsewhere, lottery funded. So yeah, I feel like it's a failed promise. There was something there that, you know, was experimental, but it was a failed promise. And I think we might want to revisit those moments and think, well, what kind of work do we want to do, and what do we want cities to look like in that way?
Thanks, Justin. That's really interesting. We've got quite a variation of people dialing in from all across the country, and as far as field as upstate New York. But there'll be quite a lot of people on the call from Sheffield that have found that really interesting. Lisa, we are coming to you for your question.
Yes, my question is relating to, in the UK, education policy has deprioritised arts and culture. And we're now seeing the direct impact of decline in students taking up arts and culture courses at higher education, combined with the reduction in arts and culture funding from local government budgets. How can the next generation, particularly those in area of social deprivation, participate and discover culture as a potential career?
Yeah, thanks. You were very quiet, but I think I caught all that. I mean, again, going back to kind of more polemic stuff about the creative industries, I find it incredible the hype that's around the creative industries. It's going to take us into the next century. It's our big export. It's the only thing post-Brexit that's blah, blah, blah. And yet they cut all the courses, the university courses. I mean, where do they think the script writers for the next big Netflix is going to come from? Where it's, you know, I'm actually sometimes quite, you know, if you go to, I spent a lot of time in China, and they said, right, we're going to have some of this. We're going to have cultural industries. They call it cultural industries. We're going to have television. We're going to have, and they put shitloads of money into it. They build design universities, and they do value chains. They set up production facilities, all those kind of things. We might not like what comes out of it, but they have now got a very thriving cultural industry sector. South Korea did similar. Why is it then that the UK, which is supposedly this powerhouse, does everything it can to cut the arts courses, and, as you say, stops them in school? We could also add cuts the BBC, which is the one obvious world-leading creative industries institution. Oh, let's cut that. We don't like that. So I find it quite bizarre. But that's on a pure industrial policy thing. But just on in terms of equity, again, we get all this stuff about art for everyone, everywhere. If you don't get exposed to it at school, if you never have any access to them, even the most basic, it's pointless. It's actually hypocritical is a mild way of saying it. How can you speak these words when you do this? And so it makes me really, really mad on that.
Interesting and great question, Lisa. We've just got one last question, which I'm going to try and crowbar in. Malakia, are you able to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, it's probably a bit of a big question, and I know that we've not got much time, but it's just maybe in response to a lot of what we've been discussing about, like, moving away from the kind of growth paradigm and like the economic values of the arts. And I think we've touched kind of briefly on maybe some social values of the arts, which very often come back to how we save the public sector money, so kind of end up being also economic arguments, right? But I guess, like, when you're kind of talking about like this fulfillment or these like the arts as a foundational part of society, like, what do you see, like, how do we value the arts then? Like, what is, if we're going to change the sector and we want, you know, the sector to be this rallying cry towards, like, this is how we want to reimagine it. I mean, maybe this is a bit of a challenge, but like, what are the new values of the arts that we should be foregrounding that can really genuinely replace this economic argument?
Yeah, well, and I mean, it's a big question, but it's to the point, really. And there's a chapter in the book called, I think, Necessity or Luxury, where I use actually quite a bit of Brian Eno there, one of his John Peel lectures. You know, is art this? Because we've been taught that, you know, you get the basics, you know, you get the basics, and once you've got a modicum of material kind of security, if you like, then you can start doing the arts. So it's the kind of cherry on top of the cake, and of course, to some extent, that's true. If you're in direst poverty, there's certain things you can't do. But in fact, that's a very Western concept of what culture is, and I'm arguing the book. Our culture is the only culture in the history of the world that would see art and culture as something that comes right at the end, you know, of material things. You know, it's part of what we are, and it's, you know, it's present there in, as I say, 40,000 years ago, its presence in the rock art of the, you know, Aboriginal communities in Western Australia. It's there in the caves of France. Quite clearly, there's a symbolization of what they are, what they think the world is, that's been there with us. I think it's coterminous with humanity itself. I said this recently in Liverpool, and somebody said, "What about the Neanderthals?" You know, well, maybe they're not, but it's that symbolization is coterminous with what it is we have that makes us human, and I mean that quite basically. And the reason why it's so fundamental to it, it's not just, oh, a bit of the symbolic thing is part of what we are. It is, but of course, we are the animal that does not know what to do. We have no script. You know, there are certain basic impulses that we have, but we satisfy that basic impulses very quickly. We do not know what we ought to do. That's why we're cultural animals. We have to decide, what should we do? We're not driven by instinct and behavioral repetitions. We must always ask, what is it that we should do? What is it that we ought to do? And culture, even in the narrow sense of art, about symbolization, about thinking, about imagining, what if, it's metaphors, it's science. This is what is actually fundamental to the way we actually conduct our lives. And without some kind of symbolic relationship to the world, we're not human. So it's actually really fundamental to who we are, and how that is over time is historically it's changed, and it's been used in good ways and bad ways, etc. But the idea that we can eviscerate that. We don't need it, or it's secondary, it's a entertainment or something like that, is a real civilizational disaster, I would say, at that big scale. So it's asserting that what we do when we do art is it's a part of how we are when we're human. And if any system that is not allowing a space for that, people to participate in, not necessarily professionally, they can be of that, but that everybody should have the right to participate, to contribute to the conversation called culture. And that's why it's a human right, and that's why we can't allow it to be taken away from us.
Thank you for that. I think that's a really poignant place for us to wrap things up and draw things to a close. And thank you for the question. I thought it was something really great to end on. Really appreciate everyone taking the time today, wherever you are, whichever time zone you are in. That was absolutely fascinating from start to finish. I have dropped a couple of links in the chat for you, which you can link through to sort of Justin's other work, but also specifically the book. There's also a link for the festival debate. If you are in a position to donate, your support does help make the festival happen and keep it accessible to as many people as possible. So if you are in a position to do so, please help if you can. And also there's a link in there for the full festival program, which, as I mentioned at the start, started this week on the 16th and runs all the way through to the 25th of May. It includes over 140 speakers, 50 partners, and 65 events across those 6 weeks. But yeah, we will wrap things up there today. Thank you so much, Justin. That was genuinely.
Thanks for everybody. Thanks for coming along.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Hopefully see you at some other point during the festival. And thank you once again for Justin.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye. Good night.